This is every Pokemon VGC World Championship explained in half an hour. 2008. Taking place in a small hotel conference room in Orlando, Florida, this World Championship is almost unrecognizable compared to the World Championships nowadays inside massive arenas with tens of thousands of fans in attendance. For starters, the video game championship series wasn't actually even called VGC yet, as in this inaugural season, it was called VGS. But the much more significant difference was the number of countries represented, as only the US and Japan were present. With 32 players invited to Worlds this year, the entire tournament was just one best-of-one single elimination bracket. And not only were we 15 years away from open team sheets being a thing, but team preview didn't even exist yet. Anyway, of the 10 Japan vs US matchups in the first round, Japan won 9 of them, beginning a trend of Japanese dominance at Worlds for years to come. With this Worlds being played on Diamond and Pearl, some of the best strategies were weather, especially rain and hail, as due to a glitch, Thunder and Blizzard could hit through Protect during their respective weathers. And while not weather related, Machamp could similarly glitch his way into becoming an Urshifu cosplayer by breaking through Protects himself with his powerful Dynamic Punch. But probably the single best strategy was Sleep Spam, with Hypnosis having 70% accuracy back then, and of course the dreaded Dark Void Smeargle, which was exactly what helped Japan's national champion win Worlds this year, as his level 1 Smeargle and Trick Room Bronzong lead allowed him to almost guarantee he could immediately twist the dimensions. From there, he could put his opponent's Pokemon to sleep before they could even move, giving room for his Snorlax in the back to set up a belly drum, and his final Pokemon, Metagross, to come in and psych up the attack boost. And keep in mind that back then, Steel types resisted Dark and Ghost type moves, so Bronzong and Metagross had even fewer weaknesses than you may be accustomed to. 2009. This was the first year the circuit officially became known as VGC, and with it came the first time European players were included in a World Championship since the first ever Worlds back in the year 2000. But Worlds this year moved from Diamond and Pearl to Pokemon Platinum, which fixed all those aforementioned glitches as well as nerfed Hypnosis's accuracy. But this Worlds was still dominated by Snorlax and Metagross, thanks of course to their excellent stats and typing, but also due to Explosion and Self-Destruct. See, the games back then never told you this, but these two moves actually halved your opponent's defense as part of their effect, making them effectively 500 and 400 base power respectively. Anyway, the two finalists had some of the craziest team compositions in VGC World's history. The runner-up from Japan had both Hippowdon and Shedinja on his team, and keep in mind, safety goggles didn't even exist yet. He was also rocking other unconventional picks at the time in Yanmega, Moltres, and Rhyperior, making his team look like it was almost like a collection of Pokemon from an in-game Nuzlocke. But the eventual champion, Kazuyuki Tsuji, also from Japan, used his tried and true duo of Toxicroak and Empoleon. This is the duo that also helped him win a regional championship back home in Japan's circuit. And Empoleon didn't even have competitive or defiant yet. It was just there because of its unique typing, spamming Surf next to Dry Skin Toxicroak. As you can probably tell, VGC was a much different game back then, with a far lower power level than we have nowadays. But the big controversy this year was that compared to the year prior in 2008, there were a lot more players interested in competing in the VGC circuit. However, there were only 128 open spots at each regional championship. And if you wanted to compete in Worlds, well, there was no way to qualify without entering one of these regional championships. And the way Pokemon decided on which 128 players would get a chance to play was unfortunately with a plain old lottery. This left a number of the West top players unable to even attempt to qualify for Worlds this year. 2010. And thankfully, Pokemon learned from last year's backlash, allowing everyone who showed up at a regional championship to actually get a chance to play. This led to NA in Europe, this time sending most of their top players to represent them at Worlds. And with it being held in a massive resort in Hawaii and finally featuring most of the game's top players from numerous different countries, it was fitting that the format this year allowed players to use up to 2 restricted legendaries in battle for the first time in VGC history. And unlike nowadays, literally every single one of the restricted legendaries was viable. In fact, all of them except Rayquaza advanced into the top 8, which was actually a bit surprising because Rayquaza was coming off a first place finish at the US National Championship just 2 months prior. But the lack of Rayquaza helped pave the way for all 4 different kinds of weathers to make it into the top 8 as well, with this year in particular being one of Abomasnow's best ever in its entire VGC history, as it was legitimately one of the best Pokemon in the entire format, and one of the most creative teams in VGC history featured it, as Weehaw took his Abomasnow into the quarterfinals alongside an Iron Ball Trick Room Mewtwo with Blizzard and even Parasect. But the creativity didn't stop there this Worlds, as even Lantern played a big role in advancing into the top 8. As you can probably tell after hearing about the success of these Pokemon, Kyogre was a huge threat, so having Pokemon that could heavily counter it no matter how obscure they were, like Parasect, Lantern, and weather changers like Abomasnow, was key to advancing far this Worlds. Unfortunately though, Kyogre proved to be just too strong, with all those pocket picks fizzling out in the top 8 and Kyogre advancing as part of every single player's team in the top 4. But one of the best new moves introduced in Diamond and Pearl continued to be one of the best strategies this Worlds too, Trick Room, as 3 of the top 4 teams had both Cresselia and Dialga capable of twisting the dimensions. And I invested a bit more heavily in Trick Room than the other users of it in the top 4 did, having items like Iron Ball dropping my Kyogre and Groudon speed in order to always move first. With Fake Out Hariyama allowing me to all but guarantee I can set it up, I also had the Kyogre and Ludicolo duo who can excel outside the twisted dimensions. Now, one of the key rule set differences between all Worlds up to this point and all the Worlds after is that because there was no team preview yet, you were actually allowed to swap held items in between games during the best of 3. Because when you registered your teams, you had to register your 6 held items as well, but they weren't assigned to specific Pokemon. This meant that depending on the matchup, players could have their Kyogre hold an Iron Ball to outspeed everything in Trick Room one game, a Life Orb for more damage against teams where it doesn't need the decreased speed another game, and even a Choice Scarf to outspeed everything out of Trick Room in a game 3. It was truly a nightmare to play against, and all the top players this generation built their Worlds teams with this kind of item swapping strategy in mind. But at the conclusion of this year's Worlds, even though America claimed first place, Japan was still seen as the strongest country, as every single quarterfinal match but one saw Japan defeat the US head-to-head. Meanwhile, Europe was still seen as the big underdog, as across their first 2 VGC Worlds, they still had yet to manage to break through and qualify for the top cut bracket. But that would all start to change. 2011. This was the first Worlds played on the new Generation 5 games, Black and White. And with it, VGC got a lot closer to modern competitive play, as we finally got Team Preview added to the games. This also eliminated the held item shenanigans you could do last generation, but also added a brand new type of held item that would raise the power level of Pokemon closer to what we know today. Gems. Gems came in every type attribute and provided a one-time 50% boost to the first move of their respective type. This made attacks like Dragon Gem boosted Draco Meteor and Flying Gem boosted Acrobatics almost impossible to defend against, especially when the newest pseudo-legendary Hydreigon and one of the newest legendaries Tornadus became 2 of the strongest Pokemon of the generation. But 2011 was the first Worlds to feature a limited Pokedex format, which is actually very similar to what we've seen these first few months in Pokemon Champions. Only the small pool of Pokemon found natively in Black and White could be used, which kept the power level down compared to what it had been in the past. This also opened the door for Pokemon who otherwise would have never seen the light of day to not only actually be used at Worlds, but even have a lot of success. Pokemon like Electros, Emboar, Beheeyem, and Samurott made it into the top 8, yet never accomplished anything else at a tournament ever again. But when it came to more common Pokemon and strategies of this Worlds, aside from those occasional creative bad Pokemon, the format was mostly dominated by Pokemon like Thundurus, Tornadus, Terrakion, Amoonguss, and Scrafty, with Thundurus and Terrakion being particularly problematic because they induced a whole lot of luck-based outcomes. Prankster Thunderwave combined with Fast Rock Slide gave anyone playing this Worlds nightmares, and is something I'm sure Pokemon Champions players nowadays can relate to. And yet another thing Pokemon players nowadays can relate to is domination by Wolf Blick, because this was the year he burst onto the competitive scene, where he managed to make it all the way to the top 8. But perhaps the even larger breakthrough this tournament was by European players, because up till now, Europe had yet to advance to the top cut bracket. But this year, we saw a whopping 5 Europeans make it to the final 8. As for the Asian countries, this year Japan unfortunately had to withdraw from the World Championships due to the horrible natural disaster. But we also saw the circuit continue to expand, with Korea taking part for the very first time. But in the finals, we saw Matteo Gini of Italy face the defending world champ, me. And fitting for his last name, Matteo had one of the most creative ways to counter the Genies: his rivalry Haxorus. This gave his Haxorus a massive boost in power when attacking the always male Thundurus and Tornadus, while decreasing its power against female Pokemon. But even though no one had been using Haxorus before Worlds, I intentionally surrounded my Thundurus with all female Pokemon just in case someone ended up using it. And luckily for me, this paid off massively, as my entirely defensive Thundurus was the MVP of the finals, and quite frankly, the entire tournament. Because up till now, Thundurus had been used exclusively as a fast attacker, and often with the electric gem for even more power, which when looking at its stats made a lot of sense. But when I looked at Thundurus, I saw an oppressive form of speed control and disruption, thanks to its prankster ability and Thunder Wave. And as many of you probably know, this way of using Thundurus would catch on and become the standard for many years later. But I wasn't just using common Pokemon with uncommon sets. I also had some pretty off-the-wall Pokemon on my team, like Gothitelle, who was deemed so bad that Smogon even refused to publish a guide on it. Keep in mind, this was before it ever got Shadow Tag as an ability. I only used Gothitelle since it was a bulky psychic type that could provide speed control, while also naturally being fast enough to easily outspeed max speed Amoonguss, a set that was surprisingly common back then. And I also used Escavalier, as the combination of its stats and typing made it a great answer to Trick Room teams, which were really common in the lead up to Worlds after Wolf won US Nationals with one. 2012. After 2011 restricted players to only the Pokemon native to Black and White, 2012 allowed all of the franchise's Pokemon back into competitions, which meant that while the occasional Gen 5 Pokemon would see play, it was pretty much just Thundurus that saw a lot of play, as this year was dominated more by older Pokemon, especially when holding Gen 5's new gems. Japan also made their return this Worlds, making top cut as they tend to do, while Europe continued their surge with another 2 players making it into the final single elimination bracket stage. Seijin Park of Korea also reached the top cut in his first year in the oldest age division. But the biggest storyline this Worlds was the old guard versus the new guard, as in the finals at this year's World Championships, people got to see a rematch from last year's quarterfinals, the defending 2-time world champion versus the back-to-back national champion and rising star, Wolf Glick. Wolf had one of the most creative teams in the entire tournament, led by his favorite Exeggutor, powered by a Sunny Day Cresselia that was capable of skill swapping its Levitate to Wolf's Heatran. All while I had one of the most boring teams in the entire tournament, just a collection of what I felt were the 6 best Pokemon in the format. Because even though I won the last year's Worlds with a much more unique team, I noticed that the Pokemon I thought were strongest this time weren't the same Pokemon everyone else was using. For example, most players were using Latios, while I thought Hydreigon was the better dragon type, since Cresselia and Metagross were so common. And speaking of Cresselia and Metagross, most players that year weren't using them the way I thought was best. That was to set up Trick Room, and then swagger my own Lumberry Metagross to turn it into a devastating sweeper. And in the finals this year, that decision to go with Trick Room Cresselia instead of the more common Icy Wind Cresselia, which Wolf was also using, proved to be the difference, helping me become a 3-time world champion. 2013. And this was what might have been the start of power creep becoming extremely apparent, as this Worlds only added a handful of additional new Pokemon. It's just that one of them would go on to become one of the strongest Pokemon ever made, Landorus Therian form. And this newly released Dream Radar gave players access not only to the Genie's new forms, but also to the next major change this Worlds, the introduction of hidden abilities. This made a number of the new Gen 5 Pokemon even stronger. But this Worlds would go on to have one of the more diverse rosters of top Pokemon, as the up-and-coming Seijin Park would reach the quarterfinals with Magmar and Marowak, and Pokemon like Rhydon made it to the semifinals, and the anti-meta Mamoswine would take down the entire tournament. Which, speaking of that Mamoswine winning Worlds, that also became a historic moment, as this was the culmination of the past 2 years of Europe's improved performance, with Arasho Madi of Italy becoming the first ever European world champion. Now, this Worlds also had, the historic in a bad way, infamous semi-final match featuring Aaron Cybertron Zhang, as this match encapsulated all the things that we dislike most about competitive Pokemon, as all the RNG elements from Thunderwave, Rock Slide, and Swagger made Aaron completely unable to even play the game. But the lone bright side from that was Aaron's sacrifice would cause Game Freak to nerf all of Thunderwave, Swagger, and the Prankster ability, so future Pokemon players wouldn't have to go through all the suffering he did. Though we're still waiting for that Rock Slide nerf. 2014, and this was the birth of Mega Evolution. But because this was the first year of a new generation, this Worlds, just like in 2011 with Black and White, only allowed players to use Pokemon found natively in X and Y. The big difference though, while Black and White didn't have any of the old generation's Pokemon in its native Pokedex, X and Y did have some, which meant that some of the strongest Pokemon in the format this Worlds were classics like Garchomp, Tyranitar, Salamence, and Rotom. But the cost was that very few of the actual new Pokemon introduced in Generation 6 saw any play. It was only really Talonflame and Aegislash that made any kind of major impact this first year. And these two were actually strong enough that they'd both be nerfed in future generations. While Aegislash only had its stats decreased, Talonflame's Gale Wings used to activate no matter what its HP was, not just if it was at full HP. This made it an offensive powerhouse, as it could spam increased priority 120 base power Brave Birds over and over. But if you consider Mega Evolutions to count as new Pokemon, then we did see a lot of diversity there at least. Of course, Kangaskhan, Mawile, and Charizard Y were heavily used and put up great results, but this Worlds also saw a lot of the lesser used Megas like Lucario, Gyarados, and Venusaur make it into the top cut bracket too. And speaking of diversity in the top cut bracket, the countries represented were also extremely diverse. We saw Japan, Korea, Germany, America, Spain, the UK, and for the first time in VGC's history, Australia all have representation in the top 8. But the biggest storyline this Worlds was of course Seijin Park of Korea, who before this Worlds was seen as an up-and-coming star. And this year, he finally managed to break through after a 5th place finish at both of the previous 2 Worlds, winning the World Championships with one of the most famous bad Pokemon, Pachirisu. Most teams this Worlds featured pretty fast and offensive teams with little defense or setup, trying to overwhelm opponents through sheer offense. Seijin though decided to play the game on his own terms, as his Gothitelle with Shadow Tag could trap opponents on the field while lowering their attack stats, paving the way for his Mega Gyarados to set up with Dragon Dance. This would let it become faster than all of its opponents, and because they lacked defense or setup of their own, once Gyarados got a couple Dragon Dances, it became capable of soloing entire teams before they could even attack. And if the opponent had Pokemon bulky enough to survive attacks from a boosted Mega Gyarados, Seijin had his famous Follow Me Pachirisu ready to protect it, redirecting any attacks aimed for Gyarados onto itself. 2015. Moving from X and Y to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, this Worlds brought back all of the previous generation's Pokemon that weren't native to X and Y, which led to one of the least diverse World Championships we've ever seen. Landorus Therian was on 7 of the top 8 teams, Kangaskhan, Heatran, and Amoonguss were on 6, and Cresselia wasn't far behind, being used on 5 of the top 8 teams. Which, when you look at the first letter of these Pokemon's names, led to these boring bog standard teams simply made up of the strongest Pokemon in the game to be dubbed the notorious Chalk. The other major story from this Worlds was about the absolute domination by Japan, who captured 7 of the top 8 spots. But Shoma Honami would grab the crown back for Japan with his version of Chalk adding Thundurus. 2016. This World started to swing the diversity pendulum back the other way, with the addition of the restricted legendaries, of which players could use up to 2 of per team. This year was a throwback to 2010, which was the last time these powerful legendary Pokemon could be used. But the game had changed a lot since then. Mewtwo, Dialga, Palkia, they were no longer some of the strongest legends. In fact, they were some of the weakest, because it was Primal Kyogre, Primal Groudon, Mega Rayquaza, and the new Gen 6 legendary Xerneas that dominated the format. In fact, these were the only 4 restricted legendaries players even used in the top 8, and these new primal forms were incredibly powerful. Groudon, for example, became a ground and fire type, but his new Harsh Sunlight made all water type moves, which hit him for double super effective damage, completely fizzle out. Not to mention that Primal Evolution didn't even count as a Mega Evolution. So you could still Mega Evolve a Pokemon like Kangaskhan or one of the new Megas in ORAS, Salamence, as these two were also incredibly strong this Worlds. And fitting for their lore, Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza were a bit like trying to play rock, paper, scissors to get the upper hand with your weather. All while Xerneas was off on its own doing its own entirely separate thing. And that was being one of the strongest setup Pokemon the game has ever seen, because the combination of Geomancy and Power Herb let it double its special attack, special defense, and speed all in a single turn, which led to one of the strangest Pokemon you'd probably never expect to be on 7 of the top 8 teams at a World Championship. But Bronzong was everywhere in part because it could counter Xerneas so well. Not only was it bulky and resistant to Fairy, but it could use Xerneas' boosted speed stat against it. Trick Room would allow slower Pokemon to move first, while Gyro Ball would become a 150 base power move against it. Bronzong also worked really well with Groudon, as Gravity could turn it into an unstoppable Trick Room sweeper, and if you ignored Bronzong while it did all this setup, then it could spam Hypnosis too. And speaking of sleep spam, we can't talk about this Worlds without mentioning Smeargle, because not only could it use Dark Void to sleep both opposing Pokemon at 80% accuracy, but it also had Moody, which would randomly double one of its stats. This was infuriating to play against, because not only could random speed or defense boosts win you games, but Moody could even boost evasion or accuracy back then, either making it impossible to hit Smeargle with an attack, or making its own Dark Void reliably hit. Yeah, Smeargle used to be even more degenerate than it is now. But one of the most surprising results after Japan dominated the previous year was that this World's top 8 didn't feature a single Japanese player. And this was the only time it's ever happened in the entire history of VGC, aside from 2011 of course, when there were no Japanese competitors. But one of the least surprising results was the eventual winner, with Wolf Glick finally capturing the game's highest title. And he did it with one of the most innovative counter teams in VGC history. Following in Sajan's footsteps with his own underused electric Rodent, Wolf's support Raichu was extremely effective in shutting down these legendary behemoths, thanks to Nuzzle and Endeavor. And Raichu's Lightning Rod could even protect his primal Kyogre from super effective electric type attacks. But the star of the show was the hate that Wolf's concoction had for primal Groudon and Xerneas, who were the two most common restricted legendaries. Mega Rayquaza was capable of shutting off Groudon's weather, enabling a Kyogre that was stuck on the field in the desolate sunlight to hit it with a double super effective water spout, while Mega Gengar was capable of trapping Groudon on the field so Kyogre could then come in and one-hit KO it. And being a poison type, it could also trap Xerneas on the field without taking much damage in return, while Bronzong could also come in and wall it, and the combination of the two can knock out even a Geomancy boosted Xerneas with ease when he's 17. And like 2014 and 2011 before it, with a brand new generation comes a Worlds where players are limited to only Pokemon found natively in that new generation's games. This included all the Gen 7 Pokemon newly released in Sun and Moon, but also a handful of older Pokemon who could be caught in Alola, like Arcanine, Salamence, Porygon 2, and Snorlax as some of the strongest. But unlike in Generation 6, this time a ton of the brand new Pokemon became top tier. The Tapus, the Ultra Beasts, regular Pokemon, and even Pokemon's brand new attempt at regional forms. And like 2011, it was an electric type legendary that was most dominant, with 7 of the top 8 teams including it. This was because the Tapu's signature terrain setting abilities, aside from Tapu Fini's Misty Terrain, would give moves of their respective types a 50% power boost. But each of the terrains also provided separate small benefits, such as blocking priority moves and preventing status conditions. Now, as for Tapu Koko, it had dominated the entire year leading up to this Worlds alongside Arcanine, whose usage was also usually around 70% of all teams. That led to top finishers of this Worlds debuting a really smart counter strategy. They decided to replace Arcanine with a different fire type, one who had barely been used up to this point, Alolan Marowak, because thanks to its Lightning Rod ability, Tapu Koko couldn't touch it, and it would even protect your allied Pokemon from Tapu Koko's insanely powerful Gigavolt Havoc. This was Sun and Moon's new mechanic. Z moves, where once per battle, assuming your Pokemon was holding a Z crystal, they could launch a ridiculously powerful attack. Some Pokemon even had signature Z moves that only they could use, which were often even stronger than regular Z moves. But this year's world champion, Ryota Otsubo, not only got revenge for Japan's poor showing the year prior, but he also utilized the anti-meta strength of Marowak and the power of Z moves to perfection. With 2 of the terrain-setting Tapus, his Normalium Z Whimsicott became capable of using different Z moves, which Ryota could control at will. When Tapu Koko's electric terrain was active, Whimsicott's nature power would turn into Thunderbolt, and the Normalium Z would turn it into Gigavolt Havoc. But when Tapu Fini's misty terrain was in effect, nature power would become Moonblast, whose Z move would become Twinkle Tackle. But what made this unique way of utilizing Z moves even more powerful was the fact that nature power wasn't actually an attacking move. So Whimsicott's Prankster ability would let it use these insanely powerful Z moves with an increased priority. But another big takeaway from this Worlds was the rise of Latin America, who were recently added to the VGC circuit. And Sebastian Escalante of Argentina and Paul Ruiz of Ecuador both reached the top cut, showing the world that LATAM wasn't a region to be underestimated anymore, something Paul himself would prove the very next year, 2018. And this Worlds changed everything, because Game Freak created a monster. They gave Incineroar its hidden ability, Intimidate. Oh, and they added Mega Evolution back into the game. Only this time, that came with a new mechanic change. We've come to take it for granted, but this was the birth of what we call dynamic speed. Previously, the turn order would play out based on the speed and priority of everything at the very beginning of the turn. So if you use Tailwind with a Prankster Whimsicott, you wouldn't receive the speed boost until the following turn. Now, that was still the case this generation, but not for Megas. Now, when Megas got faster, like in the case of Mega Metagross, the turn order would be calculated after they Mega Evolved, while Megas who picked up an ability that made them go faster, like Mega Swampert and its Swift Swim, they would also receive that speed boost immediately, unlike the previous generations. This was a big deal for a lot of the strongest Megas, as 3 of the game's best were Metagross, Salamence, and Gengar, who all benefited massively from it. But back to Incineroar for a bit, because Game Freak had yet to release much counterplay to Intimidate, one of the best strategies this Worlds was to utilize double Intimidate, pairing Incineroar with either Landorus Therian or Mega Salamence. This made life almost impossible for all but the strongest physical attackers, which gave rise to Pokemon like Snorlax, whose Belly Drum set didn't really care about Intimidate, and Snorlax was almost impossible to KO, because not only does it have a massive HP and special defense stat, and dual Intimidates to reduce physical damage against it, but the previously useless Pinch Berries were buffed into arguably the best items in the game, as they went from restoring a measly 1/8 of your HP to now restoring half, but only when your HP fell into the red. For Snorlax though, his Gluttony ability caused these Pinch Berries to activate when his HP fell into the yellow, and when paired with Recycle, Snorlax could bring back its consumed berry, restoring its HP over and over and over again. And this was exactly the strategy Paul Ruiz used to win this year's World Championship. He had dual Intimidate with Incineroar and Mega Salamence, and could have his setup Pokemon take advantage of those Intimidates, with that same Mega Salamence knowing Dragon Dance and the aforementioned Belly Drum Snorlax. 2019, and this Worlds brought back the restricted legendaries. But since the last time we had this rule set back in 2016, Game Freak had added some new top tier legends to the mix. Lunala, Yveltal, and Necrozma Duskmane were all really powerful, with each of them reaching at least the semi-finals. Necrozma Duskmane was most interesting, as its Z move, Light That Burns the Sky, let it completely transform into a brand new Pokemon, which was crazy. But if these new age Pokemon mechanics are giving you a headache compared to the way it was at the beginning of this video, don't worry, because Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza were still just as good as they were in 2016. And considering the insane power level of the format, it was still relatively diverse, as aside from Incineroar, who was on 7 of the top 8 teams, the next highest was Kyogre at 5 out of 8. But we did get to see another rarely used fan favorite have an incredible run this Worlds, as Hirofumi Kimura's Umbreon garnered everyone's attention, as he made it all the way to the finals. But it was Naoto Mizoguchi who'd defeat Hirofumi and his Umbreon using the classic Groudon and Lunala duo, alongside a Trick Room Stakataka with a Lonely Nature and a 17 defense IV. While it's not something you can do anymore, with its Beast Boost ability, Naoto intentionally lowered his own Stakataka's defense. That way, whenever it took a KO, its attack would get the boost instead. 2020. 2022. Yes, if you're counting properly, you will have noticed that we've skipped ahead 3 whole years. That's because there were no World Championships due to the once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. But once Worlds finally returned, the Sword and Shield generation was already just about over. In fact, because it was the last year of Gen 8 before Scarlet and Violet's release, just like had been the trend for the final year of a game's lifespan, the last rule set of the generation would allow restricted legendaries yet again. But there was one big change. I alluded to it earlier, but Sword and Shield is where dynamic speed as we know it today was fully implemented. This meant that Tailwind and any other speed boost you could give your Pokemon mid-turn would change the order that the turn progresses immediately. This led to Sword and Shield's new generational mechanic, Dynamax, being incredibly powerful for anything that learned a flying type move, as Max Airstream gave both of your Pokemon a speed boost on top of doing massive damage. So some of the best Pokemon to be Dynamaxing this Worlds were all Pokemon who could take advantage of that, like Charizard and Thundurus. And speaking of Charizard, his special Gigantamax form could use a signature move, G-Max Wildfire. This move was absolutely broken, because at the end of the next 4 turns after using it, both opposing Pokemon would lose 1/6 of their total HP, unless they were a fire type themselves. That meant that, in total, this move did an extra amount of residual damage that equated to an entire Pokemon's full health bar and then some. And considering Charizard has the Solar Power ability, pairing it with Groudon to boost its G-Max Wildfire even further was one of the strongest things you could be doing this Worlds. In fact, this team archetype became so common, it became known as Rinya Sun, named after the first Japanese player to start having success with it. But while it took 3 of the top 8 spots this Worlds, first place was not one of them. That belonged to Eduardo Cunha, whose Zacian and Calyrex Shadow Rider team took him on an undefeated run to his World Championship victory. Zacian, while not being able to Dynamax himself, was incredibly strong, as his signature Behemoth Blade would do double damage against Dynamax Pokemon. With a massive attack stat and an ability that gave it a free attack boost every time it entered battle, a blazing speed stat making it faster than almost everything, and one of the best dual typings in the entire game, Zacian was the most feared restricted Pokemon. Calyrex Shadow Rider was also extremely fast and strong, and kind of opposite to Zacian, rather than start out with an attack boost, it would gain special attack boosts every time it took a KO. This allowed it to checkmate opponents like no other Pokemon could, while Focus Sash would make up for its poor defenses and multiple devastating weaknesses. Edu could also use his Calyrex as a support in a pinch, as he was one of the only players using moves like Snarl and Will-O-Wisp on it, but his Dynamax Thundurus provided all the speed control Edu needed, while bulky Pokemon like Incineroar, Rillaboom, and Gastrodon let him pivot his frailer, more offensive attackers with ease. 2023, and with Scarlet and Violet came the newest generational mechanic, Terastallization. This was one of the most unique and most skillful mechanics to date, because not only did players have to carefully consider the timing that they use their Terastallization, but there were so many different ways to utilize it. Offensively, if you needed a bit more damage to get over the hump on a KO, defensively, if you needed to remove your original weaknesses and survive incoming attacks, and for utility, such as becoming a grass type to ignore Sport and Rage Powder, or a dark type to gain an immunity to Prankster boosted support moves. But perhaps the biggest change this generation was the addition of what we call open team sheets. This let both players see each other's entire teams, Terra types, held items, moves, abilities, everything but natures and the way players train their Pokemon stats were revealed. This drastically improved the consistency with which top players were able to perform well, and was the reason why we saw in this generation more than any other, the best players in the game were repeatedly dominating every tournament they went to. Open team sheets really turned the game even more into something resembling pure chess. But this first World Championship of Generation 9 featured a wide array of Pokemon, those native to Paldea, as well as a bunch of Hisuian Pokemon and legendary and starter Pokemon from prior generations. But the most dominant Pokemon by far was Game Freak's unseen mistake, Urshifu, who was on every single top 8 team this Worlds. Scarlet and Violet's new Paradox Pokemon were also everywhere, led by Fluttermane and Iron Hands as the premier past and future forms. And the Treasures of Ruin were also incredibly strong thanks to their signature abilities, which lowered all other Pokemon on the field stats. Chiempao led the way here thanks to its defense lowering ability, finding its way on more than half of all top 8 teams. But the best team this tournament proved to be Shohei Kimura's Worlds winning collection 7 of the game's strongest Pokemon, with all 4 of the aforementioned Pokemon, as well as Amoonguss for support and Landorus Therian for a mixture of damage and support. 2024. This was an extremely unique Worlds, as for the first time in a long time, players would have to play in a brand new format we'd never had before, because while restricted legendaries were allowed, you could only use one. Now, the downside to this rule set was that since restricted legendaries are so powerful and warp the entire direction of the team you build around them, the game felt more rock, paper, scissors-like than any other format. On the plus side, none of the strongest restricted legendaries felt like they had major RNG elements like move inaccuracy or random chance side effects, unlike some of the previous years. And while Zacian dominated Sword and Shield, it was Zamazenta taking up the mantle of top dog among that legendary duo thanks to its new move pool edition of Body Press. And despite the nerf to Calyrex's Glacial Lance, it was still strong enough for Trick Room teams to perform exceptionally well, making it as far as the finals. But it was Luca Cherubelli's Miraidon team taking home the title, with its absolutely busted ability automatically setting up the electric terrain just like the previously overpowered legend Tapu Koko. It's crazy that it also got a 33% boost to its special attack whenever the electric terrain was active. And when wearing the choice specs, Miraidon's Electro Drift on the electric terrain was capable of one-hit KOing almost everything in the game, with the future paradox, Iron Hands, being able to similarly get an attack boost on Miraidon's terrain. Luca was able to incorporate a Trick Room mode with the priority move blocking Farigiraf to dominate both inside and outside the twisted dimensions. 2025. And like 2024, we're still in an era with restricted legendaries. Only this time, we've moved from 1 per team up to the classic 2 per team. The strongest duos this Worlds were the likes of Miraidon and Electric Seed Lunala, Calyrex Shadow and Zamazenta, Calyrex Shadow and Koraidon, and the World's winning duo Lunala and Koraidon. And just like Luca the year before, Giovanni Chischi built a team that could function both in and out of Trick Room. Lunala could reliably twist the dimensions and not only do a bunch of damage itself with the Power Herb and Meteor Beam combo, but Ursa Luna could punch massive holes through teams as well. But the team also had a speedy component for outside Trick Room. Max Speed Life Orb Koraidon could, just like Miraidon, one-hit KO all but the bulkiest of Pokemon. The Past Paradox Fluttermane and Legend of Ruin Chi-Yu were both made even stronger by Koraidon's Sunlight, and Brute Bonnet was the glue that held the team together, supporting the team the same way Amoonguss does, but it would get even bulkier under the harsh sunlight, while its typing gave it a huge advantage against Calyrex Shadow Rider in a way Amoonguss never could. And that brings us to today. Just how will Pokemon Champions World Championships unfold? Well, we'll just have to wait to find out.